Experimental work supports the idea that children's drawings use the repertoire of the real even when they are encouraged to depict the unreal, adding, subtracting, or changing the position of something already known to them. For example, developmental psychologist Annette Carmiloff-Smith asked 4 to 6-year-olds and 8 to 10-year-olds to draw a house, a man, and an animal that did not exist. 1990. The older age group invented characters that were made up of real elements. Albert arranged in novel ways drawings a man with an extra hand, a man with a leg growing out of his shoulder, or a man head and chest fused with the body of an animal, for instance. The 4 to 6-year-olds had much more difficulty in providing these relatively complex drawings. 10% or fewer achieved the goal, and those that did often produced similar solutions, such as altering the shape of a component part or omitting it altogether. The fact that children's drawings are resistant to wild departures from reality is perhaps a little unexpected given how much fantasy children are exposed to. At least in weird societies, children's TV films and books frequently start from unrealistic assumptions and are full of characters imbued with magical powers, animals that talk, princes that turn into frogs, and carriages that turn into pumpkins. Even in these cases, when asked to explain what is going on, children ground their explanations in what would make sense in the real world. For example, most children judge owning a unicorn to be impossible, but when pushed to offer an explanation, they give non-magical reasons such as, well, they probably got it from pet store, or maybe she won it at the farm in a different country. Paris 2021. Despite the prevalence of fantasy in media aimed at children, there is some evidence that when invited to make a choice, children might prefer stories with realistic outcomes over unrealistic ones. For example, when researchers presented 4-year-olds with either a realistic or fantastical story and asked them to fill in the missing parts of the story, children mostly opted for realistic continuance. Weisberg et al. 2013. Both the realistic and the fantastical stories had the same overall event structure. A boy and his dog got ice cream, went to a petting zoo, and came home for dinner. But unlike the realistic story, the fantastical story included impossible elements, such as a child could fly and animals that could talk. Adults, by contrast, when presented with the same set of stories, chose to continue the story in the style they heard, opting for realistic continuations for the realistic story and mostly fantastical continuance. For the fantastical story in chapter 11, we will look at what children's own stories can teach us about their creativity and how they vary across different societies. What about the imaginary companions that some children carry around in their own heads? As far as we are able to tell, invisible companions play by similar rules as visible ones. For example, imaginary friends are motivated by the same psychological characteristics of an ordinary person. He or she interacts as a playmate or confidant, expresses thoughts and emotions, eats and sleeps, and is a source of reassurance and sometimes of frustration. This tendency to encourage the in-role play and to an imaginary companion is correlated with the ability to think accurately about other people's mental state. Paris 2021. The idea here is that the role play and imaginary companions can act as mental training ground for the kind of theory of mind skills that children will need later in development. Key points. Young children have a preference for explaining the supernatural in terms of the natural. When children have imaginary companions or impersonate others, they tend to draw on repertoire of behaviours from real life. We might think children sometimes wander around in their own reality, but the general message from children's drawing stories and imaginary friends is similar to that from tool innovation, pretend play, thinking about the future, and making judgments about possibility. Imagination in these areas is not any goes free for all. Children do not routinely generate extraordinary possibilities, but are instead making more likely to conjure up worlds that obey the rules of everyday life. Far from being a deficit in their creativity, this is better understood as a form of strategic rehearsal for the future. By using the imagination for entertaining unrealised but realistic possibilities, they gain a problem-solving playbook to consult when they encounter analogues situations in the future. Talking point. The idea that innovations build on the insight of previous generations is captured by the following phrase: "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." We first encountered this phrase when we looked at social learning in children, chapter 5. The quote has been previously attributed to Isaac Newton, but rather fittingly, variations on the phrase have been around since at least the 12th century, showing that Newton was just the latest in the long line of people who had tinkered with the same underlying idea in slightly different ways. Many cultural innovations work this way, as remixes or mashups of history. Innovations often marked not by how few sources they draw on, but how many, so much so that it becomes difficult to trace the origins of all of them. This does raise the broader question of what we mean by imagination, creativity and originality. For any idea, song, poem or piece of tech that we think of is a true leap of imagination or a radical departure from convention. We can almost trace its roots back to something that went before, even if the elements are brought together in unique ways. This goes for children's creativity too. As head-mounted cameras, smartphones and wearable tech are gathering more data on the amount of and the variety of children's experience, we are likely to discover that much of what looks like children's creativity on the surface might be grounded in the roots of their history. Summary. Tool innovation emerges relatively late in childhood compared to other complex skills. Tool innovation places significant demands on higher order thinking skills and is hindered by the preference to imitate the conventional use of an object. Children show signs of greater inventiveness as they get older and get better at identifying a workable solution among a range of possibilities. Children capitalize on personal experience when imagining what might happen in the future. As children's experience grows, they get better at acknowledging the improbable events are still possible and that their predictions about what is possible may be wrong. Imaginary worlds of children often reflect the local practices and routines of adults, and their pretend worlds largely reflects on the realities of their everyday lives. When presented with a premise does not fit within